group of U.S. senators has been voicing support for Israel on a visit to Tel Aviv as the Gaza war continues. The Republican Senator Lindsey Graham had this message for Iran.
We're here today to tell Iran we're watching you. If this war grows, it's coming to your backyard. There won't be two fronts, there'll be three. If there's an effort to unleash Hezbollah on the Jewish state to destroy it, my attention will be to Tehran. If these innocent hostages get slaughtered, I hold you, Iran, accountable because you could stop it if you chose to.
Let's find out more about this with Mike Hanna in Washington, D.C. So, Mike, Lindsey Graham, we heard there, but this was a bipartisan group of senators in Israel. How significant a visit was this?
Well, not particularly significant. It is the second bipartisan delegation that has visited Israel since the beginning of the conflict. It is bipartisan, as I must stress, but there are very different opinions on some of these senators, the 8 senators who are taking part in this trip. We heard there from Lindsey Graham before traveling to Israel. He made several comments about flattening Gaza. There was no mention of the humanitarian situation in Gaza as a consequence of Israeli action. However, one of the delegation, another member, is the Democratic Senator Cory Booker. Now, he, for his part, has asked the Biden administration to donate some $300 million to the United Nations Emergency Relief Fund. So, obviously, there are different opinions among these senators. I must add as well, there's a senator there, John Toole from South Dakota, who refused to vote on Biden's nomination for ambassador to Israel. The reason for this is because he and some other Republicans are ideologically opposed to approving any nomination by the Biden administration. Well, you know, not voting on an ambassador at a time when there is no ambassador in Egypt could hardly be seen as helpful to U.S.-Israel relations.
Right. And, Mike, Washington is deploying more military assets to the region. What more can you tell us about this additional hardware that's being deployed, and for what purpose is it being sent?
Yes, we understand that the Secretary of Defense briefed President Biden in the course of the morning about stepping up a military presence in the region. Among the items that he discussed with him is a high-altitude missile defense system, the THAADs, more Patriot missiles to be put into the region, along with a second aircraft carrier fleet, which will be going to join one that is already in station in the eastern Mediterranean. But one must stress as well is that this is not necessarily to back Israel or to demonstrate a show of support for Israel. What it is more pointed towards is a troop protection in theater, to protect those troops who are already in theater, those U.S. troops. It's also perhaps a very strong signal to Iran. Now, the Biden administration has expressed deep concern about Iran attempting to exploit the situation in Gaza and open up another front of conflict. Moving these military resources into this particular region is clearly a signal to Iran that it better stay out of the what is happening there. Otherwise, there could be consequences.
Mike, thank you for that. Mike Hanna, live there in Washington. Well, let's discuss all this, the U.S. position, the U.S. deploying more military assets to the region now with Harlan, Ullman, who's a former Navy captain and senior advisor at the Atlantic Council, as well as chairman of the Killowen group. He's joining us from Washington, D.C. Thank you very much, Mr. Ullman, for being with us on Al Jazeera. So, as you heard there, we're seeing a further buildup of U.S. assets in the region, the biggest deployment of military assets to the region. A big military flex, really, for the U.S. Is it just for deterrence, as the Americans say, or is there a real risk today that the U.S. could be dragged into this conflict?
Unfortunately, the use of the word deterrence is a miscast, because to deter, you've got to prevent somebody from doing something, and I'm not sure what we're really preventing. We are raising uncertainty and therefore imposing some degree of ambiguity about what and why we are there, which I think is positive. But make no mistake, the aircraft carrier group Ford, which is sailing in the eastern Mediterranean, is not sailing in a huge body of water. That's a very restricted waterway. And if one merely looks at what Ukraine has done without a navy to the Russian Navy, that carrier battle group is sailing in harm's way given the use of drones and missiles. So there could be some kind of an accident. Now, if the war expands, and I don't think it will, simply because it's not in Iran's interest, we'll see how this plays out. Interestingly, in my judgment, Hamas has the upper hand in terms of public relations, because first of all, it won the public relations war on who struck the hospital. Whether or not the Israelis did it, and I don't think they did, most of the world believes it was Israel. And that they've released 2 American hostages in terms of a PR campaign is really quite brilliant. So we'll see what happens. As you know, President Biden, I think, has more than cautioned Prime Minister Netanyahu about a full-fledged offensive into Gaza. That would be a war from hell, and it would be a disaster. But what would come next in terms of an occupation is really the nightmare from hell, and that would be catastrophic. So we're really on the horns of many dilemmas, and one hopes that the conflict can be confined.
Let's talk about what comes next and this planned Israeli ground invasion, of course. We had an incident earlier today in Khan Yunis, in Gaza, where Hamas, the Al-Qassam brigades, Hamas's military wing, said they foiled an Israeli incursion into Gaza. It's not the big ground incursion that Israel is planning, but the Israelis have said that one of their soldiers was killed in this attack and 3 others injured. What does this suggest to you about what Israel is planning for this ground invasion? Apparently, this is not the first time there's been incursions into Gaza by the Israeli military. A ground offensive in Gaza for Israel, how difficult is it going to be? Because it's not favorable terrain for them, is it?
First of all, the incursion, I am sure, are special forces trying to derive intelligence about where Hamas may or may not be. These are not real attacks. They're reconnaissance in small numbers, and that makes real sense. The problem with fighting in cities, as one would have seen in Leningrad during World War II, or indeed in Fallujah and Najib and Mosul in the Second Iraq War, is impossible. Furthermore, there are a series of underground networks that probably run for hundreds and hundreds of miles. So what would happen, think about the siege of Leningrad or Stalingrad during World War II, and probably double the damage. There's no way of separating Hamas from innocent Gazan residents. So it would be a bloodbath. It would probably take months. And then the issue is, what next? The Israelis would invade with armor, lots of drones, infantry, which would be needed, all sorts of special forces and mine clearance and mine detection devices. But when you're putting that magnitude, and I would have thought it would require roughly about 80 to 100,000 troops, there's going to be huge, huge amounts of damage done. And then what happens to the population of Gaza that's going to be without food, water, and electricity? So this is, as I said, a war from hell, but the occupation would be a nightmare from hell.
Right. You talked about, Mr. Ullman, Hamas winning the PR battle right now. What about militarily? What do we know about Hamas's military capabilities right now? The Israelis, of course, say they've inflicted severe blows to Hamas, destroyed tunnels in Gaza, and so on. What do we know about what Hamas is capable of militarily if this ground invasion were to happen soon?
No matter how heinous the attack was on October 7th, it was a brilliantly organized campaign. There's no doubt about that. So I would assume that Hamas, and there's some 40 or 50,000 Hamas soldiers, and probably another 10 or 15,000 from the Palestinian Jihad. So you're facing a substantial number of enemy. I think they're extraordinarily well equipped. But remember, Gaza has become the world's largest IED, improvised explosive device. I would bet there are tens of thousands of mines and booby traps planted. And when you're talking about house-to-house fighting, you're talking about close-in weapons. So Hamas does not have to depend upon large-scale weapons just to defend itself. And don't also forget that Hamas probably still has thousands of rockets and missiles that it can launch against Israel. So this is a very formidable threat, made more difficult by the fact that this is going to be urban fighting, house-to-house, room-to-room, and that's going to be a bloodbath.
Very interesting to hear your thoughts about this. Thank you so much for your insight. Harlan Ullman, a former Navy captain and senior advisor at the Atlantic Council, joining us there from Washington. We appreciate your time.